Hi there, welcome to Pithy Polemics. We're a group of friends who are interested in discussing topics in philosophy, theology, history, fantasy, and more. My name is James Liang. This is the 7th video in a chapter-by-chapter series on Brian Davies' book, The Thought of Thomas Aquinas, which provides an overview of Aquinas' positions on a number of theological issues. In this video, we'll be discussing Chapter 7 of the book, Oneness to Knowledge, which discusses Aquinas' understanding of God's unity, omnipotence, and omniscience. Davies starts off by explaining different senses in which God is one. The first sense is monotheism, that there's only one God. In line with Augustine and Abelard, Aquinas believed that the world had a unity and order to its design, which points to one creator and designer. Additionally, he accepted the argument from Occam's razor that one should not postulate more causes than are necessary to explain an effect. Since we only need one God to explain the universe, we have no reason to think that there's more than one God. However, Aquinas' real reason for holding to monotheism deals with the second sense in which God is one, that his nature is identical to his being. You guessed it, we're right back to the doctrine of divine simplicity. You'll remember that on Aquinas' view, individuals of the same kind only exist because they're composed of both form and matter, with matter being the individuating aspect. Since a simple God is not composed of form and matter, there can't in principle be two instances of the same divine essence. Since what God is and who God is can't be distinguished, it follows that there can only be one God. Since God is uniquely perfect as a purely actual being, everything else must be less than perfect and therefore cannot be God. God is existence itself, unacquired and undivided, not one among many in a class, but a class unto himself. Davies continues with a discussion of God's omnipotence. Normally, when we talk about power, we distinguish between active power, the power to do something of our own accord, and passive power, the power to have something done to us. On Aquinas' view, God only has active power because he's pure act and impassible. He can't be affected or acted upon by anything. Additionally, God isn't capable of doing something that's logically contradictory, such as making a square circle or changing the past, or that conflicts with his nature, such as sinning. What omnipotence means then is that there's no limit to the number of possible effects God can bring about. Finally, Davies continues on to his discussion of omniscience. This part's going to be a little difficult to grasp without a solid understanding of Aquinas' epistemology, so if you have a hard time following, I recommend rewatching the video on Chapter 3 before proceeding. To begin, let's remember that Aquinas was an empiricist in the tradition of Aristotle. On this view, human beings gain knowledge by receiving information from things via the senses and processing and abstracting this information in their minds. The mind is able to abstract the form from an individual instance of a given thing, and the form comes to exist in the mind. For example, when we look at a dog, our minds abstract the form of the dog, both the substantial form and the accidental form, and we come to understand what a dog is. For Aquinas, we have knowledge when we can conjure the form of something in our minds without needing to perceive an instance of it through the senses. Thus, the object of our knowledge is not propositions, relations, or experiences, it's things in of themselves. So how does this help us understand how God has knowledge? Well, Aquinas observes that the difference between knowing things, like human beings, and non-knowing things, like plants, is that the former can have forms immaterially, or in their minds, while the latter can only have their forms materially. What this suggests is that the more something can separate form from matter, the more knowledgeable it is. Since knowledge for Aquinas is having forms immaterially, it follows that the more immaterial something is, the more it knows. Therefore, since God is completely immaterial, having pure form and no matter whatsoever, God is completely unrestricted and unlimited in his knowledge. Davies then leads into a discussion of what things God knows. First of all, God knows himself. This isn't a kind of introspective knowledge that we might have of ourselves. Rather, because of divine simplicity, God and God's knowledge are indistinguishable, and thus, God knows himself simply by being God. The subject and object of his knowledge are identical. What this further implies is that God doesn't have one thought after another, but has all of his knowledge at the same time, and that his knowledge doesn't change. Second, God knows his creatures. As an extension of his self-knowledge, God knows that he is the creator and sustainer of the universe, and therefore knows all of his creatures perfectly. Third, God knows his creatures individually, not just their similarities, but also their differences, since he is the maker not just of form, but also of matter. Fourth, God knows future contingents. According to Aquinas, even though the future is not determined, God infallibly knows what will happen in the future because he exists outside of time and sees the past, present, and future all at once. This is essentially Boethius' solution to the problem of divine foreknowledge as presented in the Consolation of Philosophy. Lastly, God knows everything causally prior to their existence. Unlike many ancient and modern thinkers, Aquinas firmly believed that because God's knowledge and act are identical and nothing can act upon God, God's knowledge can't be dependent on anything else. Rather, the arrow of causation flows from God's knowledge of things to those things coming into being. Just as a craftsman sees what he wants to make before he makes it, God's knowledge causes things to exist, not the other way around. It's at this point that Davies ends the chapter, so it's time for my evaluation. First, with regards to the oneness of God, it seems to me that Occam's razor is the most persuasive argument for monotheism. Why posit more than one cause of the universe if one suffices? While the argument that there's unity in the design of creation is interesting, I'm not sure how it would stop someone from saying that the sun is different from the rain, so there needs to be a sun god and a rain god. I'm not saying there's no merit to this argument, but I just don't see it as being very decisive. As for the argument from divine simplicity, I personally don't subscribe to divine simplicity, so I reject the claim that God's oneness entails no distinction between his essence and existence, and therefore, this argument doesn't work for me. That being said, I do concede that if you hold to divine simplicity, then it gives you a much stronger case for monotheism. But if it'll free me of all the baggage that comes with divine simplicity, I'd be more than happy to just live with Occam's razor. Now, when it comes to omnipotence, I think we have a lot more common ground. While I reject divine impassibility, I would generally agree with Aquinas that omnipotence means God is capable of doing anything that is logically possible, except I would add a few extra nuances. Philosophers distinguish between logical possibility, which just deals with logical contradictions, and metaphysical possibility, which deals with metaphysical laws that govern reality. The former allows for a broader range of states of affairs than the latter. For example, there's no logical contradiction in the statement, the prime minister is a prime number. But such a state of affairs is metaphysically impossible because numbers are abstract objects with no causal powers. So one modification I would make is that God can't do anything that is metaphysically impossible, not just logically impossible. In fact, I would go even further and distinguish between metaphysical possibility and feasibility, which deals with what God is capable of actualizing in light of certain facts. For example, it's intrinsically possible for the Astros to have won the World Series this year, but it's not feasible for God to make it so, because he doesn't have control over people's free decisions. So in the end, I would conclude that omnipotence means that God is capable of actualizing not any possible state of affairs, but any feasible state of affairs. Lastly, as for Aquinas' understanding of God's omniscience, I'm rather sympathetic to the idea of God's knowledge being simple in nature. God doesn't have to think one thought at a time, perform calculations in his head, or dig through his bag of knowledge to find a fact he needs at any given time. He just has all of his knowledge at once. But notice that you don't have to hold to divine simplicity to believe this. In fact, holding to divine simplicity forces you to accept some rather strange ideas about omniscience, like God's knowledge being identical and inherently tied to his power and active creation, which I would want to keep separate. Furthermore, the additional constraint of impassibility means that the problem of divine foreknowledge is all the more potent for the Thomist. If God's knowledge of creatures' actions is causally prior to their performing of those actions, then how can you escape the conclusion that all of our actions and decisions are determined? Boethius' solution doesn't work because even if God timelessly sees the future, it would still be the case that the future is determined, albeit timelessly. So it seems to me that the only game in town is the one that Aquinas rejects, that God's knowledge is determined by the free decisions of creatures. Just as an infallible barometer accurately tracks the weather, God's knowledge tracks true facts about what is, was, and will be. Just as the barometer doesn't cause the weather to change, God's knowledge doesn't cause people's decisions. This strikes me as a far more plausible view of God's omniscience. So that's it for my thoughts. Next time, I'll be summarizing Chapter 8 of Davies' book, Will to Mercy, which explains Aquinas' account of God's will, love, justice, and mercy. I hope you enjoyed this video. If this has been helpful to you, please help us out and like, share, and subscribe. Also make sure to hit that bell button for notifications. If you think I'm onto something or you think I'm dead wrong, please feel free to drop a comment down below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you like this content, come check out our channel for more videos on interesting topics and discussions. With that, I'll see you in the next video.